Hello, this is Chiak. Hello, this is Chiak. So, the live stream just suddenly ended on its own. I'm assuming my internet, for whatever reason, completely cut out, which is extremely annoying. So yes, continuing on for that, this will be part of chapter 28, which got canceled because the last stream just suddenly ended. And we'll continue on to chapter 31. Okay, sorry, I've lost my place since I had to up again. But let's see. Here, I'll start from here. The captain sat there with his enigmatic half smile and just kept drinking. Jency sat on the edge of a box a few feet away, observing the conversation, but not really being part of it. The thing I don't understand, said Swanson, once he is why did they choose us? They could have had any captain they wanted for the prices they were offering. Why us? The captain shrugged. Just luck, I guess, he said. Just luck, said Swanson. No, he said. You've had luck before, but it's mostly been bad. Maybe it was time for my luck to change. Or maybe they knew you could be discreet, said Swanson, tapping the captain on his chest. The captain didn't seem to take the tap badly, but did say, not all of us in this room are so discreet, at which Swanson seemed to take the hint and stopped talking. They kept drinking, Swanson the most, followed by the captain. Jency was having just enough to keep up appearances, watching carefully for the captain's gaze to go glassy and his hand to begin to wobble. After a while, Swanson crawled off his box, laid down on the floor, and passed out. The captain put down his glass and stood, straightening his jacket, but Jency stopped him. There's still some in the bottle, he said. It'd be a shame for it to go to waste. Halfway through the next bottle, he'd gotten the captain to talk openly. He wouldn't say the name of Aspera, but he'd hinted enough about confinement and treason and the price of freedom that he didn't have to for Jency to feel confident about where they were going. He kept prodding the captain, encouraging him, but either he was exceptionally discreet or the man really did know almost nothing about Aspera. He'd done deliveries, but he'd always stayed in orbit. The only ones to go down to the planet's surface were the freight specialists. And in this case, he'll only be Swanson, said the captain. They'd have had to clear you back at the spaceport on Vindagua if we wanted you to go down. You can load up top in orbit, but you can't go down. So, there's another problem he would have to face, he thought after the captain had left. As he was slapping Swanson and trying to coax him awake, trying to get him to return to their quarters, he had to figure out a way down to the planet. Maybe he could prepare a box, slip himself into it. Or maybe Swanson could end up sick and then he'd have to go. But the former option involved a certain amount of risk, particularly if he was caught, and the latter would draw attention to him as well. He managed to get so he had to keep shaking him to keep him talking. He hoped Swanson wouldn't remember any of it in the morning, and suspected he wouldn't after seeing how the man was the next day after previous drunken occasions. The process was this. They were to link first to the military ship in orbit, which would either give them permission to contact the penal colony or not. Then they would start taking loads down in the shuttle. Typically, Swanson would land outside the colony in a small dome that had breathable atmosphere, and then he and Talbot would unload. There was usually a military ship already landed there with 2 soldiers, and once he and Talbot had unloaded everything, the soldier went over and the manifest and carefully divided the items into 2 piles. Why 2 piles? Asked Jency. Swanson shrugged. I don't ask about these things, he said. If they want to divide them into 2 piles, which is fine with me, but if I ask about it, maybe they will ask me to help them move the boxes. He looked at Jency, his eyelids heavy, as if awaiting a response. I see, not knowing what else to say. This seemed to be enough. Swanson nodded. Talbot, he didn't ask about either, but he thought about it, said Swanson. And what did he think about? He didn't have to think much about it, he said. We always saw the other set of lights when we were preparing to land. There's another complex on the planet beside the penal colony. What is it? Another penal colony? asked Jen. Swanson gave a sloppy shrug. Why would they need two penal colonies? He asked. No, Talbot didn't think so. He thought it must be something else. Like what? Who knows, said Swanson, and then his eyes started to close. Jency shook him. What? Asked Swanson, coming to with a jerk. If it's not a penal colony, what did Talbot think it was? I don't know, said Swanson, but he figured it this way. They had us land near penal colony and unload there, not near the other complex. That means that the other complex, whatever it was something that they wanted to hide more than the penal colony. Some sort of black ops operation, thought Jency, but much more hush-hush than a secret penitentiary in which they would illegally imprison and perhaps even torture traitors. What could it be? Whatever it was something deadly serious, and perhaps something to stay away from. Where is Talbot, by the way? Swanson asked. Talbot? Jency said Jency. He couldn't make it. Swanson smiled. Too bad, he said, and fell asleep. He pulled the man's boots off, tucked the blankets around him. So he couldn't officially board the shuttle. And even if he did manage to get on the shuttle, he got back on again and left. And if he hid himself in a box, there were apparently about equal chances he would end up at some sort of secret compound rather than a penal colony. And to top it off, there was only a day or maybe two left before they arrived. "29. What are you looking for exactly?" asked Henry. "We'll know when we find it," said Bryden curtly. "At least he hopes we will," said. There were 6 of them in all, with Bryden and Dexter clearly in charge. They arrived only a few hours after the commander's call, bringing with them a vehicle full of equipment, which they had promptly started stringing all through the space that Henry normally occupied. Some of them were sitting on the floor, others standing idly by. Bryden had immediately commandeered his desk and chair, which made it so that Henry had to watch the monitor standing. He wasn't doing a very good job of that, though, since he was distracted by the newcomers. "How dangerous are they?" asked Bryden. "These are killers or what?" "A few weeks ago, I would have said not at all that dangerous," said Henry. "They're political prisoners. They feel very strongly about whatever their cause was, but usually are fairly ordinary apart from that." "A few weeks ago, you said Bryden. "What about now?" "Now, I don't know," he said. "They're restless. Something's wrong with them. I can't predict how they'll behave." Bryden was staring at him strangely. He came a little closer, took him by the arm, spoke softly. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Me?" said Henry, surprised. "Fine, I guess." He tried to keep his eyes from darting around. What if this was a trap? What if all this had been set up as a way to trap him? Maybe that was why the project was classified. He tried to push the thoughts down, swallowed. "No anxiety?" asked Bryden, standing too close to him and narrowing his eyes. "No changes?" Said Henry, not sure what it was best to answer. "I'm all right," he finally said. "It's a stressful time." Bryden raised one eyebrow. "I can see you feel it," he said, his voice even softer now. "Are you a believer?" "A believer?" asked Henry. Bryden reached into the neck of his shirt, pulled out his icon, a small twisting shape. "The unitologist would be praised," he said. "No, sorry," said Henry, almost too quickly. "I'm not a believer. Not that I have anything against it." "You will be," said Bryden, slowly tucking his icon away, a smile still frozen on his face. "You're feeling it already, but you just haven't admitted it yet." And with that, he turned away, went back to directing his team and setting up the equipment, leaving Henry a little shaken and not quite sure what to do with himself. It's here, thought Bryden. I'm sure of it. Whatever the marker wanted them to find was to be found here, and he, Bryden, was going to be the one to find it. He had been chosen to do so. His calling was a sacred one, and he could almost feel a holy crown there shining on his head, invisible for all to see except the truly sacred, the truly chosen. He would find it, and he would do whatever he needed to do to protect both it and the marker from all unbelievers. It had been a mistake to approach Wandre the technician as he had, but he had felt something. Everybody felt a little bit of something. That was how powerful the marker was, reaching out to believers and unbelievers alike. But for most, it was nothing significant. A headache, a little anxiety or nausea. More and more people, though, were sensing a call to convergence, a call to lose their life so that they could find it, so that they could find a larger sense of unity and life in the One. Already 6 people among their numbers had let go of their lives, or had had them taken away by a well-meaning soul. And Bryden had made very certain that their bodies were prepared and preserved for the day they might rise again. Yes, he understood that the work here was holy. And there was Callie Dexter beside him suddenly. She was his affliction, a thorn in his side. She did not believe, and he knew better than to speak to her about his belief. She would not attack him and would try to use it against him. No, she was there as a test for him, something for him to fight against and overcome, in subtly and with great care. We're all set? Bryden asked. Callie nodded. All the monitoring equipment is in place. Now we just wait for a surge. Yes, said Bryden. But there are things we can do in the meantime. Things? Like what? We need to get a feel for the place, he said. We need to walk out there and sense its energies. Energies, said Dr. Dexter. What sort of mystical bullshit are you trying to feed me? I mean, measure for any anomalies, said Bryden, backtracking. Magnetic abnormalities, pressure irregularities, any unusual readings of any sort. Anything that... There you go again, said Dr. Dexter, always thinking of the marker as human. Bryden bristled. He wasn't thinking of the marker as human. Sentient, yes, but hardly human. It was far beyond human. It's just a metaphor, he said. I don't mean anything by it. Dr. Dexter gave him a hard stare. I wish that were true, she said. All right, let's see what we can find. "30. The voice and the changing face that went with it were with Istvin almost all the time now. Very quiet most of the time, but still something he could hear and understand as long as he was listening in the right way. It was like having a brother again, as his brother had done. No, this was a new friend. Someone he felt that was willing to be with him forever. Someone with whom it was beginning to teach him things. He could feel it sometimes touching his brain lightly, smoothing parts out of it, scrunching other parts of it up, and doing so in a way that was beginning to build something within him. It was a strangely intimate session, as if someone had their hand in his head and was caressing his brain softly, and he wondered if he shouldn't be afraid. He was, admittedly, a little afraid at first, but then it stroked a particular part of his brain, and the fear diminished at least a little. There were shapes and figures beginning to form, strange, twisted, and watery shapes that he could not only see, that he felt somehow, if he just had the right tools and the right training, he could build. It could be glorious, the voice whispering in his head had told him. Glorious, the next step in evolution. Marvelous convergence, the extension of consciousness from bodies to a place both within and between bodies. It was wonderful, so wonderful that he almost didn't feel the pain as the burst came, stronger than it ever had been before, and took him into the other world. He could it too, though not in the same way as he was. Where the fingers in his brain moved delicately, stroking and rearranging in a way that he found at once sharp and exhilarating, they must have felt like their heads were being torn off. Indeed, once the burst faded and parts of his vision started to return, he did see that the man roughly across the table from him had beaten his head over and over against the surface of the table until that head had cracked open. Blood was pooling on the surface of the table, slipping over it and toward Istvan. Istvan watched it come, unconcerned, not moving even after it began to drip slowly into his lap. Was the man dead, he wondered? What had been the convict's name again? And then he decided that it didn't really matter. He wasn't dead yet, but he'd be dead soon. The alarm went off, sending them back to their cells. The other convicts looked almost in shock, some of them wandering aimlessly about, others just staring at the body, one hitting his head over and over again with his hands. But slowly they began to come back to themselves and move. Istvan braced his hands on the table, to either side of the pooling blood. But before he stood, the voice said something to him. "Wait," it said. "Wait?" he said. "Why?" But for once, it didn't answer. He looked around him, at the other convicts moving back to their cells, at the dead or dying man across the table from him. What did the voice know? If he listened to it, he'd be beaten by the guards, maybe killed. He again started to stand. "Wait," the voice said again. He stopped, confused. Why should he wait? What did he gain by doing so? No, it was a mistake. And yet, he waited. The loudspeaker crackled out its warning, giving him 30 seconds to return to his cell. He counted it down, and then counted a minute or so more before he heard the cell doors clang close. Now it is too late, he told himself. Now you are in trouble. He raised his hands and put them behind his head so that they didn't rush this time. They were moving more slowly, dressed in riot gear, and were flanking 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, dressed in ordinary clothing. New prisoners, he wondered at first. But no, their hands were free. They were at ease and relaxed, and they were carrying various pieces of technical equipment. The door closed behind them. Slowly they moved through the rings of cells and toward the central circle. People in the middle, a man just approaching middle age with salt and pepper hair, who was apparently their leader, shook his head. No need to bother him unless he becomes aggressive. Leave him as he is. The scientists came forward, sweeping their way into the room, moving back and forth, the guards awkwardly flanking them and sometimes bumping into them as they moved in unexpected directions. Istvan just stayed there watching them come. "Check and see if that one is dead," said the apparent leader. "Will do, sir," said one of the guards. He came forward and examined the man slumped across the table, then stripped off one glove and pressed his fingers into the man's neck. "He's dead," he said. "Ugh," said one of the others in the group, a woman, ghastly. But despite saying that, she came forward and stared at the body with some interest, as if fascinated, then shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't see it." "Of course you saw it," she said. "You were sitting right across from him." "I heard it," he said, "but I didn't see it." 2 of the guards were assigned the body. They dragged it away by the arms, leaving an irregular smear of blood in its wake. The The other guards and the people with their machines kept circling around, slowly narrowing their focus until they were all standing around Isfin. "Right here," said the leader. "I'm sorry," he said to Isfin, "but you'll have to move." "You can move now," said the voice to him, and he saw again Khan's ghastly face flash up before him, his strange smile. "You can go back to your cell." "Isfin, to my cell," he said. Distractedly, the leader nodded. Yes, he said. "Go on then." Hands still up, he walked away. The guards' eyes followed him, as did their weapons. He could feel their eyes still on his back as he went slowly out of the inner circle and into the cell circle, and then stood by the closed door of his cell, waiting. There's like a smallest they missed the in that typo. Either way, last chapter for today, 31. Right here. He turned to Callie Dexter. "I'm right, aren't I? Some kind of anomaly, something that responds in a particular way to the crystalline structure of our marker." "Seems so," she said. He smiled. "So directly under the floor, I'm assuming. We get something in here and we start to dig." Callie shrugged. "Not enough data to know for certain," she said. "Sure there's enough," said Bryden. "It led us here, didn't it? There's nothing here on the surface, so there must be something below." They put the one loose convict back in his cell, then sent someone back to the marker compound for a contact beam and an engineer to operate it. Took an hour, maybe more, but finally they were there and cutting through the floor. The going was slow at first. The engineer working the contact beam and some of the guards recruited to shovel out the rubble. There was a certain amount of damage, Braden knew. They might break into a cavern or other space without breathable atmosphere, and then those standing near the hole might as well be killed, which was why he stood at a little distance away. Callie Dexter, though, was up close and leaning in, curious, watching the work. He imagined her eyes bugging out and her gasping for air, and it gave him a certain perverse satisfaction. He smiled, though he did eventually call for breathing equipment just in case. But no reason to stop the digging while waiting for it to arrive. They went down 3 feet, maybe 4, without finding anything beyond dirt and rock shot through the veins of crystal. Maybe that was it, the crystal. Or maybe there was something there deeper down. They needed another pulse, something they could correlate and trace and make sure they were on the track. But it might be hours or even days before one came. Another 8 feet, the contact beam ran out of fuel and they replaced the cartridge. And then it overheated and the engineer hauled himself up out of the hole by rope, shaking his head. "We'll have to let it cool down," he said. "A few hours at least. Besides, it's time to sleep." "We should keep going," said Bryden. "I'm sure we're nearly there." The engineer wiped his face with his hands. "There's nothing down there," he said. "Nothing but rock. You're wasting your time." Bryden was eager to keep this. He realized it was prudent to wait. "All right," he said. "A little something to eat, a few hours of sleep, and then we can start again." They would find it. Bryden was sure they would find it. It was waiting for them. Markers had led them to this spot. It had to be there. This was a test of faith, a test of his faith. If he was to be their prophet, he had to persist, had to go on. He'd pushed at the food in front of him, stirred it around his plate, but ate very little of it. Many of the others had already gone off to catch a few hours of sleep on the spare cots in the guards' quarters or alongside the technicians. "Penny for your thoughts," said Dr. Dexter. She was still sitting across from him, observing him closely as if he were a specimen. He shook his head. "Bryden," she said, and for once her voice was gentle, a little hesitant. "You have to realize that there may be nothing there." "But the readings," he said. You saw them as well as I did. We traced them as closely as we possibly could. The readings have been slightly different each time. Maybe there are 4 moments and then not. Or maybe the markers are off somehow. Maybe they're trying to broadcast to something that no longer exists. But no, he thought. It couldn't be that way. It had to be real. He'd invested too much of his life in this project. He knew it was real. The marker was speaking to him. He could feel it when it pulsed. Unlike Callie, he had faith. He believed in this, believed in what he was doing. There had to be something there. Look, she said. I said it earlier. We need more data. Data, he groaned. What good will that do us? We know where we should be. We need to dig. We need to keep digging until we find something. What are we going to find? She asked. How should I know? He said. But I'm sure something is there. The marker wouldn't lead us here if there wasn't. Kelly just looked at him, not speaking. What? He finally said. Nothing, she said. Why are you staring at me? You don't want to hear it, she said. Tell me. Anger flashed in her eyes. You've lost objectivity. You've let your feelings run away with you. You've convinced yourself that the marker is a living thing. You don't know if you're coming or going, Bryden. You don't know if you're engaged in an act of silence. But I do know, thought Bryden. It is an act of worship. How can you be so blind? Trembling, he managed still to keep his temper, but said nothing. When Callie spoke, it was calmer. I know you're trying, she said. We're all trying. And then she reached out and touched his hand. He pulled back his hand as if he'd been bitten. Gathering his plate and utensils, he stood and left. Another test, he thought. She's just another test. Here to confuse me. She's not right. I'm right. The marker believes in me, not in her. He stalked his way up and around the ring until an hour had passed, maybe more, and his legs were sore. Then he sat in the control room, leaning his elbows on the desk, waiting until enough time had gone by that he felt he could wake the others up and start them digging again. He tried to gather himself, tried to bury the irritation and doubt Callie had made him feel. Not Callie, he told himself. Dr. Dexter. How could she unsettle him so? But soon, he told himself, everything would change. Soon everyone will know that I was right and she was wrong, and we'll see who unsettles whom. They dug deeper, another 16 feet before the contact beam burnt out entirely. The engineer came up shaking his head. Not made for this kind of work, he said. It's better for just clearing up small piles of rubble. You need something larger, a borer, something you can sit in. A borer, said Bryden. Well, let's bring one in. The engineer shook his head. We don't have one, he said. We'll have to get one sent in. Let's do it, said Bryden. How long will it take? A month, said the engineer. Maybe 2. A month? 2? There has to be another way, he said. The engineer shrugged. We've got another contact beam or 2, he said. We could burn those out as well, maybe get a little deeper. But I have to tell you, there's no indication that anything's there. The rock that's there, it's been in place probably for millions of years. There's no evidence that it has ever been disturbed. Another test, thought Bryden, tightening his lips. But who was to say that whatever was there, down below, hadn't been there just that long? The marker technology could be eons old. And that was when it happened. Another pulse, a strong one, which left Bryden lying on his back right next to the hole that had been dug, almost falling in, his head throbbing, his vision almost obscured. For a moment he saw something, or someone, but he couldn't make out their features. And then, for a flash, it was his dead father's face. And then that too vanished, and he was panting, lying there, staring into Callie's eyes. Are you all right? She asked. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Near him, a guard had fallen to one knee and was groaning. One of his own researchers was tearing at his hair. From the cells, he could hear the cries and howls of the prisoners and realized that one or maybe two, or maybe more of them, were probably in the process of beating themselves to death. More corpses, more souls opening themselves to God, as he himself would do as well, only not yet. "Did you feel it?" he finally managed to say. Callie nodded. "I felt something," she said. One of her eyes, he noticed, was leaking tears, but only one of them. "Wasn't it glorious?" He couldn't stop himself from saying. She scowled. "Don't be fooled," she said, and pulled him up. The guards were scattered and confused. The two other scientists were slowly calming down, one of them standing there with tufts of his own hair in his hand, the other massaging her temples with her fists. "It's changing," said Bryden. "It's growing stronger. It's becoming more dangerous," said Dr. Dexter. "We need to be careful." She gestured around her at low patches of mossy tendrils clinging to the floor and walls. "You see what's happening to the corruption?" she said. "There's more of it now. It's spread with the signal." "Then it's part of the marker," said Bryden. "We shouldn't be trying to clean it up. We should try to encourage it to grow." Cassie shook her head. "It's just a byproduct," she said. "We should get rid of it. We need to be careful." She unstrapped her portable reader, getting the feed from the computers in the control room, checking the signal, figuring out where the exact before I tell you, she said. "Let's see if we end up with the same reading." He took out his reader and turned it on. The other two scientists were doing the same with theirs. He waited for the new data to load, choose it, then waited for it to compute the next his location. At first, when the distance was still great, it looked just fine, as if he was exactly where he was meant to be. But as the machine dithered and the map scale became more precise, he realized that no, he was nowhere near the nexus, was perhaps 100 from it. He looked at Callie's screen, saw the same. "We needed more data," said Callie. "Told you." He nodded, began to move here and there toward where he thought the new nexus was, Callie alongside him, the two other scientists following behind. Still a little shaken, it moves. Still a little shaken. It moves, thought Bryden. But what was it? What did that mean? Perhaps it was something they couldn't see, something they wouldn't be able to catch hold of. But still, he kept walking, kept following his reader. They came to the wall at the end of the inner circle, but they weren't quite there. It was on the other side of that, somewhere in the cell ring. He exchanged a look with Callie, and they both down it, tracking down the hall. They passed half a dozen cells until finally on his bed, his feet flat on the floor, his hands flat on his knees. His eyes were closed, and he was breathing slowly in and out in a very measured way. "It's here now," said Bryden. "If we start digging right away, maybe we can catch it this time." Bryden, no. "No," he said, turning to face her, angry. "Who's in charge here? If I say dig, we dig." But she pulled him back, pulled him away. He was just one of the... He was sitting at the table. "No," said Bryden. And now here he is, sitting just where we got our most recent reading. She sounded at once excited and confused. Her objectivity momentarily shot as well. "Bryden, we're not looking